Hey guys, I thought I'd give you a little brief 14-minute lecture on the Mongols, which is really their first section under empires. So Mongols, they're really exciting to me. I mean, wow, they created the largest empire the world ever saw. They were a bunch of pastoralists, which basically meant they were herders. They followed their herds to good grazing pasture. These clans constantly fought amongst themselves up until Temujin, Genghis Khan, unified them. See, the Mongols would follow a strong leader. It wasn't hereditary, you had to earn it. And Temujin started off really a very, very difficult life. He was made a slave by a neighboring band, but eventually, through his own fearsome warrior tactics, he began to draw other nomadic pastoralists to him until he was named Kagan, or the universal ruler. You could see that the Mongols were pastoralists. They fought with very strong bows that were made out of horn. And these compound recurve bows enabled them to spread throughout from the baseland, which you see there in Mongolia. Karakorum was their capital, throughout the region, and eventually even conquer China. So discipline, their army was the key to success. That and mobility. They could move maybe 100 miles in a day at a time when, most armies couldn't go 10 miles. And they would be brutal for a reason. They knew that if people feared them, they would be more inclined to open their gates. So anybody who resisted them got destroyed. The men were killed, the women were sold into slavery, and their city was burned. So that's why the Mongols had such great success. Their massive mobility, the toughness of the warriors, and their ability to mobilize their resources. Here you could see some Mongol warriors. Several of them would lead remounts, so you usually had more than one horse. In fact, the Mongols could ride all day. They could just jump from one horseback to the next. Their ponies were ugly little things. They were shaggy and short. If a Mongol was hungry, he could nick the ear of the pony and drink its blood. He would put his meat underneath the saddle that would cure it with the pony's sweat. He would make his alcoholic drink from the mare's milk. So pretty much everything the Mongols did relied upon their horse. So China was one of the first main targets. It was really difficult because there were so many walled cities. They had to develop new siege tactics. Again, cities that resisted were destroyed. So consequently, they'd come up to the next one, and maybe the gate would be thrown open because people didn't want to see their sons die and their daughters be carried off. But they would create a unified China under Genghis's grandson, Kublai Khan. This was also coincided with a time period where many Christian missionaries arrived in China and tried to convert the Kublai and the other leaders to Christianity. The Mongols were shamanistic, which meant they believed in the spirits like the wind, yet they were very tolerant of all religions. As long as you followed their rule, you could be Taoist in China or Buddhist or Islamic or Christian in Russia. It didn't really matter. The Mongols, though, did exclude the scholar gentry class, the upper class, from any rule. They brought in Muslims and Nestorian Christians to occupy governments, and the scholar gentry was very successful in getting the peasants to lead rebellions against these barbaric foreigners. And eventually the Yuan dynasty, which the Mongols created after a little over 100 years, was driven out. During this time, though, this pretty cool thing, you might have heard the term kamikaze. It means divine wind. Well, twice the Mongols tried to invade Japan, and twice typhoons hit and wrecked most of their ships. Later on in World War II, the Japanese would try to resurrect the kamikaze. Mongol women didn't really fit into the Chinese patriarchy. In their yurts, which are kind of like nomadic tents, they ruled. They were much more independent. They would never practice foot binding, and many of them weren't afraid to voice their opinions. The Mongols devastated Russia. For a couple hundred years, they ruled Russia in what was known as the Golden Horde. Many people think Russia was made almost Asiatic, meaning that it was behind the rest of the West when it came to technology and industrialization. Later, Peter the Great would try to drag Russia kicking and screaming into the more modern age. Just a couple pictures. Actually, this is the one on the left drawn by the Russians, showing the devastation that the Mongols had on the Russian cities. One of the cool things about the Mongols is they created a massive trade network. Now that they conquered what became the world's largest empire, trade flowed freely. They really liked merchants and trade. And so that's one of the reasons, like for instance, Marco Polo was able to make it from Venice, Italy, all the way into China. So they made it safe. They protected merchants. They wanted trade. You can see the Pope would send diplomats, the Persians and Chinese courts. All of these moved freely along the trade routes. And this map on the left here is depicting some of the trade routes, and you can see how it reached even into Europe and North Africa and East Africa, which is the Swahili coast. What about culture? Well, they would actually take skilled craftsmen and move them from one city to another. That way they could spread different technologies. As you see, they were religiously tolerant. In Karakoram, the Mongol capital, Buddhist scholars, Christian scholars, Islamic scholars, they were all welcome. So it was a very cosmopolitan center, even though it was mostly a city of tents. And a lot of technology and ideas changed. For instance, the Mongols from the Chinese would use exploding arrows and things like that. One last thing I want to talk about is one bad side effect, besides that very devastating wars the Mongols perpetrated across even into Europe and China and South Asia, is that along these trade routes, the plague spread. Many people think it came from a flea that was on the Mongol ponies. And of course, the Black Death, as it was called in Europe, would wipe out, in some places, a third or more of Europe's population. It really sets the stage for the Renaissance, which is going to be your next chapter. So I hope maybe you took a couple notes, because eventually you're going to need to know some things about the Mongols. And you can always replay this and go back and take a few notes so that you get the kind of gist of a couple of their leaders, the importance of them unifying such a large trade empire, and the exchange of culture that flowed because of the Mongols. So anyway, the Mongols, a powerful, large empire. Thank you.